thank you for coming to this post-lunch session. I'm always most scared about the post-lunch session because everyone needs their nap. So it's nice that you're all here, and I will try to take as many questions as possible. One of the big shifts, I should tell, many of you are, of course, regulars here, but one of the big shifts we've seen at JLF, I think, is in the old days, the foreign policy questions used to go into much smaller rooms. But the fact that we're here out on the front lawn to talk about something that many a decade ago would not have said they'd heard of is very interesting. So yes, we are discussing that four-letter word, Quad, Quadrilateral Security Dialogue as it was otherwise known, an idea that was born apparently from a speech that Prime Minister Shinzo Abe of Japan made in India. Very important. He spoke about the confluence, so it was about much bigger ideas. It was about the confluence of two oceans. Where does the Indian Ocean end and the Pacific begin? It was a bit about bringing the regions together as well. And remember, on the continental sphere, India always had a rough time getting brought into organizations like APEC, for example, being part of that discussion on Asia and the United States continent. And he talked about what he hoped would be a concert of democracies. Many questions are still asked about the Quad in terms of will they ever be a little more strategic. Many questions are asked about whether they'll all remain democracies. And some questions are certainly asked about the idea of what these countries have in common. So our guests are best placed to answer some of those. But I want to start at the beginning with two men who really were around for its birth and its revival. I don't say rebirth because it didn't quite die. Obviously, the idea was still around. Shyam Saran was our foreign secretary during the tsunami, and then everything that followed that led to the first iteration of the Quad coming around. I want to ask you a little bit about how it started. And do you think that today what we see as the Quad was what had been envisioned way back then when the tsunami happened?
Thank you very much, Suhasini. So you are aware of the fact that when the tsunami happened at the end of 2004, beginning of 2005, several countries were affected, including India itself. But what was remarkable was that India was, in a sense, first off the block in delivering urgent supplies, relief to a number of countries in the region. Not only our neighbors like Sri Lanka, the Maldives, but also Indonesia, Thailand, several countries in Southeast Asia. It is only after about a week or so that our partners, the United States, Japan, Australia, also decided that they needed to, deliver relief to the countries affected. And they discovered we were already doing that. And so what happened was that during the next 2-3 weeks, India, the US, Australia, Japan began to coordinate their supply of relief to the countries affected. And I, as Foreign Secretary, used to have a conversation every morning with my counterparts in the 4 countries.
So this was in 2005?
This is early 2005. And as a result of that coordination and this constant engagement, when tsunami was over, when things were back to normal, in fact, it was the United States which said, we have had such excellent coordination amongst ourselves. We have really shown how these 4 countries, 4 democracies, could actually work together for delivering a certain public good to the region. So why not make this into a more institutionalized forum or a platform for us to actually cooperate on a number of other things, And that is how the idea of Quad then came about. That if we can do this together, and we have the capabilities to do this together, why not actually create a forum where we could have, conversations not only about maritime security, how to deal with maritime emergencies, but all the various things that are happening in what is now called the Indo-Pacific region. That's the beginning.
Certainly interesting. Prime Minister Turnbull, it sounds like the beginning of a good joke. An American, a Japanese, an Australian and an Indian go into a bar and what comes next. In your book, you have one sort of killer line, on the Quad, where you say the revival of the quadrilateral has not been welcomed in China, which was delighted when in 2008, former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd pulled out of it. India, as a consequence, has been cautious about rejoining. That sounds like a mea culpa. So Australia was responsible for the death of the first round of the Quad?
Well, it wasn't solely responsible, but it is true. Kevin, by the way, completely denies this, and since we're now going through a very amicable, friendly part of our long relationship.
He's the ambassador to the US.
The ambassador to the US. But I think the record is pretty clear that the Rudd government decided they didn't want to take it further, and it was pretty obvious that was in order to avoid offending China. At the same time, of course, Shinzo Abe ceased to be Prime Minister of Japan. There was a change of leadership in India. So there were some other factors around. But I think it's fair to say Australia played the largest role in bringing the Quad to at least a suspension. But do you want me to tell you how it was revived? Well,
yes, because you were Prime Minister.
Yeah. So I came here in 2017 and raised directly with Prime Minister Modi the revival of the Quad. And he and his Indian colleagues were a bit sceptical about Australia. Are we going to go through? I think they were. We're going to go through this again. You'll get in again and then you'll be out. It's sort of, I kind of had the feeling that from New Delhi we were sort of seen as a little bit of the, the bad boyfriend that you couldn't quite count on. And having said that, I persuaded Mr. Modi that we should get the show back on the road, and by the end of the year, at a meeting, APEC meeting and East Asia Security Summit meeting in Manila, the four leaders, that's to say Modi, Shinzo Abe, who was obviously back, Trump and myself, formally agreed that we would revive the Quad, and we agreed we would take it in the future to leaders level meetings, although that did not happen for a few years, in large part because of COVID. So, but look, India was reluctant. We've got to be honest with you. We participated in the naval exercise, Malabar, in the early years, and we didn't get back in until 2020. So I think hopefully we've now been forgiven, and there's absolutely bipartisan support in Australia for the Quad. So I don't think anyone, even the most anxious diplomat in India, should not worry about Australia changing course again.
All right. And it's interesting how that turns around the narrative a little bit about the Quad and what we had sort of always or heard in the last few years, which was that India was not keen, was the shy bride in 2007, whereas it seems as if it was Australia. Remember, that was a very different world. It was the world before Xi Jinping and then the face of China that we see today. It was the world before China's maritime and Blue Navy plans were really unveiled. So there was a little bit of vision when they talked about it. And of course, even today, the Quad sees itself very much as a, a force for good, not a counter of any other force. But the idea that China did have that kind of influence in 2007 is certainly interesting. Shyam Saran, would you agree with that characterization?
Just let me amplify what Prime Minister said. We had the first meeting of the Quad in Manila, again, in 2007. That was the first time at secretary level we had this meeting. Now, what happened was that before our Prime Minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh, was going to Tokyo on an official visit, I was contacted by our American friends, and we were told that please tell your Prime Minister not to encourage Abe on the Quad. Prime Minister Abe is very enthusiastic about the Quad. He would like to push this forward. This is not the time we should be doing this. And so I said two things. Japan is your ally. Why don't you talk to them yourself? Secondly, as far as the issue of the Quad is concerned, you are the ones who persuaded us that this was a great platform to be on. Why are you now trying to step back? And the answer was very clear. We need the Chinese today because, we have the Iran nuclear issue before the Security Council. We also have, the North Korea six-party talks that we are trying to revive. And, the Chinese are not very happy about the Quad, nor are the Russians. And we need both of them, So it's not that we are stepping back, but, for the time being, let us play it down. So we said, well, it was your initiative. You wanted to push it forward. You don't think it is convenient at this point of time? Okay, so be it.
All right, so now you have the former foreign secretary saying, mea not culpa, as in the MEA. It's an interesting now part of history. So we do want to look at where the Quad is today and what the future can be. I think it's unusual, certainly, to see the three ambassadors, high commissioners, together on a stage like this one. Although it has become part of the Quad's very normal in discourse, if you like, to have ambassadors in various capitals getting together for a Quad lunch. We see them being tweeted as well. So I'd like to come to our envoys, and first to you, Philip, simply because as journalists, when we write the Quad with Australia, India, Japan, and the US, we have to go alphabetically, but also because you have this background with the Ramcharitmanas. External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar has just written a book called Why Bharat Matters. And he says in there, the direct analogy to the Quad, that they are the four sons of Dashrath, Ram, Bharat, Lakshman, and Shatrughan. Which one's Australia?
Look, I'll leave you, Suhasini, to choose to work out that, but I'd just like to put to this audience my little bit of this history. So I've been High Commissioner of Australia in India for just 5 months. The last time I was in India prior to my assignment here, I was managing our Indo-Pacific agenda in 2019 from Canberra, and I was the person most responsible for the Quad. Now, what is really remarkable is coming here just 4.5 years later and seeing how different things are. In those days, we didn't have leaders' meetings, as Malcolm has said. In fact, in those days, it was just senior officials, not even ministers, on the sidelines of other meetings who were meeting. We didn't have an established work program. We didn't have an agenda. And those meetings of senior officials often happened without a communique. So, wind the video forward to 2023, 2024, and what have you got? You've got annual leaders' summits, you've got communiques which are full of new activities that we're doing, we've got a very strong work program, and the future is extremely bright. So, you've talked about the long history, but the last 4 or 5 years has really been the bit that's transformed the Quad.
All right. Ambassador Suzuki, I want to ask you, because you were once removed, in a sense, from this, because you were with Prime Minister Abe. Do you think the Quad today is exactly what he envisioned in 2005, in which case, he's always been known as a visionary, but this is something 2 decades in advance?
I think Prime Minister Shinzo Abe would be so pleased to see the Quad as it is today, because the fact that Quad has such attraction, the traction that number of countries want to become a member of Quad or be associated with Quad in some way or the other, means that Quad has succeeded a great deal. The Prime Minister Abe envisioned Quad as four great countries sharing fundamental values: freedom, democracy, human rights, rule of law. And those four great countries sharing strategic interests. And he envisioned Quad to be a forum where leaders of those four great countries can engage in freewheeling discussions and decide on strategic goals of where we should be heading for, so that other people like foreign ministers, senior officials like a Quad SOM or a Quad Quad Sherpas, sub-Sherpas, and working groups. As a result, working group people engage in discussions, online discussions, almost every month, almost constantly, so that we have complementary cooperation going at same direction to achieve that common strategic goal. So in my view, putting slightly different interpretations of history of Quad aside, what we see Quad today is a great success.
Is it strategic, given that they still don't see themselves as a strategic organization? It's about humanitarian efforts, it's about economic efforts. China is very much the elephant in the room, but it's not spoken about. You don't talk about doing strategic things together, and certainly the four Quad members are not alliance partners.
Well, I'll tell you what Quad is not about. Quad is not about core defense cooperation. This is best dealt with defense frameworks such as Japan-US Security Alliance or AUKUS. But Quad is about what four countries can be most relevant in addressing the challenges of the times. For example, Quad is engaged in maritime domain awareness. Quad is engaged in utilizing space technology. Quad is engaged in cybersecurity. So we're doing everything we can to be relevant of what Quad can offer in terms of helping countries in the region to address those challenging issues.
All right. Ambassador Garcetti, of course, you know, when Ambassador Suzuki said, I can tell you what Quad is not, that's what we've heard a lot of in the last few years. In fact, in India, we have the Sanskrit terms of neti, neti, neti. You want to describe anything, you say, it's not this, it's not this, it's not this, you know. Is it a bird, is it a plane sort of thing? Do you think the Quad can be Superman? The reason I ask is because the Quad did have one very touted success story, and that was on the vaccines. Eventually, it was never about producing a vaccine together because the countries just weren't able to get their acts together long enough to get vaccines from America certified in India, manufactured in India, produced and then distributed by the other two. Some would say that's a sign of the intrinsic failure of a Quad initiative. But my question to you is, how hard is it to corral everyone together in this idea of the Quad?
Well, it's quite easy. I mean, not only you see the amity that we have up here, the genuine friendship, but I think it mirrors the friendship both of leaders above us and of the people we represent and serve. There's never been a warmer period of time in any manifestation of this. You can take it bilaterally, trilaterally, or quadrilaterally. And what I love is one of the things I've learned here in India through the Quad and other things is how India has led and how we're a part of leading this new era of geometric diplomacy that's somewhere between kind of the huge multilateral level and the bilateral level, because it's a very confusing world right now. Certainly the multilateral institutions, the United Nations, et cetera, don't have much efficacy. Everybody says we're in need of reform but can't get the reform. Bilateral is always engaging, but any two countries get a little bored of each other always when it's just direct. It's like a dinner party. Invite 3 people, it gets more interesting. 4 people, now you have a party. When others want to come to the party, as Ambassador Suzuki said, now you know you've got something special. So I will answer actually with a little bit of what you said Indians do. This is not about who we're against. I think it's about who we are for and what we are for. So it doesn't have to always be about exactly what you do, because sometimes the depth of any relationship we have, human relationship, is about finding the desire to be together. You don't plan the rest of your life with your spouse, with your friends, but you do have a feeling about them, if that's something that you want to continue with and deepen with. And I can certainly bear witness to that. And my president, whose first engagement of all the countries, of all the institutions, bilateral, trilateral, quadrilateral, that he engaged in was the Quad in Washington, D.C., where he hosted the 3 national leaders. And that was a very powerful turn for us. So the history is interesting, but not that interesting to me. The present and the history we are writing is not only fascinating, it's deep. And sometimes I use this metaphor. You say, you know, who's driving this? I would say India is very much in the driver's seat of the Quad, because the 2 other nations, we have good bilateral relations. We have AUKUS. We just did the trilateral between Japan and Korea. Maybe America's in the next seat with a corrective steering wheel. I think Japan has been an avid navigator from the beginning, and Australia is just really psyched to be back in the car and asking if everybody has enough to drink and eat and where are we going. So it's, you know, a great time. We love like these different roles. I want to sit in the back some of the time and relax, but it's in some ways up to India to most forcefully define what we want to do with the Quad. Our relationship bilaterally doesn't depend on that, but what the Quad can be and model for the world, when you see things like I2, U2, when you see other quadrilateral kind of potentials, these are very strong, stable shapes, not just in geometry, but I think in diplomacy, and we're beginning to see that.
All right, but the only problem with all these great analogies to eating and drinking and going out together is that the Quad often just gets called a talk shop. And when it comes to issues that matter, you mentioned the I2U2, but the I2U2 and the IMEC, the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, all seem to have taken a pause with what we've seen in Israel and Palestine. When it came to the Russian invasion of Ukraine last year, you couldn't get the Quad countries to really agree on a common position. They may have got some kind of fiddly language that brings them into a joint statement, but at the end of the day, there were fundamental differences when it came to geopolitics, certainly between India and the other 3. Is that something that could hold up the Quad in the future?
I think we shouldn't mistake it for being a group where the 4 of us are going to agree in multilateral institutions on every vote. That would be a mistake. But it ain't a talk shop either. For instance, IMEC, by the way, as an aside, ask a representative from the Ministry of External Affairs, but that work they're saying is commencing as quickly and as deeply, in some ways, during this conflict. It is exactly the time to be doing the preparation, which people would say, why haven't you produced a corridor tomorrow, when it will take some years to do that work? Saudi Arabia has continued with that work deeply. In fact, in some ways, deepened that because they see the importance of these ties to keep and maintain peace. But we can go straight through. This is much more than talk right now, whether it's the supply chain work that we're doing. We have deep work with people looking at that, semiconductors, artificial intelligence. I think there's a vision of intelligence in the world from autocracies and extremist ideologies that are about dividing and harming you using technology. I think we share a vision of connecting and protecting, and that we're actually spending dollars. I can talk about $20 million that the Indian government is putting on research together, Quad fellows that are studying in each other's countries today. We can talk about that domain awareness in the Indian Ocean that is actually commenced and moving forward. Space projects that aren't just talk, but actually probably as robust as any place on Earth. So I don't think it's a talk shop, but it is also not ever going to be a place where, hey, how are we all going to vote at the UN together?
All right, an interesting distinction here. High Commissioner Green, do you think it's time to move on to the next step, if that was it? To say humanitarian and economic is all very well, although even on the economic sphere, I would add that India has not joined the trade pillar of the Indo-Pacific Economic Forum, and time to actually speak about being a strategic organization. The reason I say this is because India is everyone always says where you stand depends on where you sit. Now, India does sit, in a sense, not contiguous region of all the other countries. And India does sit not just in the Quad and have these great conversations there, but it is a member of the SCO with Central Asian countries, Iran, Russia, China. It is a member of the BRICS, which has already expanded. The Quad hasn't yet gotten to that point of expansion, but the BRICS has. It's gone from 5 members to 10. So India is sitting in a lot of places there. Is there a future of the Quad that you see moving on from this humanitarian economic agenda?
Okay, so let's pick up a few of these threads. So number one, how has the Quad delivered? Well, you said, Suhasini, that it was difficult to get the authorization for certain medicines to be made across country, but what did we do then? We decided the thing was to deliver vaccines. 400 million vaccines we delivered, including in our case, to some outlying communities in the Southwest Pacific, without which they would not have had an option during COVID. Number two, what is strategic and what is humanitarian? We're working on maritime domain awareness. And the principal way we are doing that is providing commercially available capabilities so that countries in the Indo-Pacific, not us, we've got it, smaller countries in the Indo-Pacific can understand what's going on in their maritime domains, including dark shipping that they otherwise don't have a way of tracking. That's strategic. What did the US and Australia announce just last week? That we are going to have a new partnership in providing branch telecommunications access to the countries in the South Pacific. So Google and the others are building big pipelines of telecommunications across the Pacific, but they go past Pacific Island nations. So what are Australia and the United States going to do? We're going to make sure that countries like Kiribati and Micronesia, the Federated States of Micronesia and the Marshall Islands get access to telecommunications capabilities that they can rely on. So, yeah, we do humanitarian work because we want to be what the region needs us to be. Our region is looking for us to play in fields that help their communities. That's natural. But it's wrong to say that the things we are doing are not strategic. They have a big strategic effect, and I'm convinced that we'll continue in that direction.
All right. Ambassador Suzuki, there's been a little bit of talk about others wanting to come in. Do you see the Quad expanding? I mean, it'll have to be called something else.
Well, I think there is a common sense among the Quad partners that Quad is still very much an embryonic stage. So we want to keep the membership as it is. But then again, at the same time, it's okay for each and every Quad member to reach out to other countries as they see fit. So Quad is a loose framework of cooperation, but it's vitally important to keep this framework as it is so that leaders can engage in freewheeling discussions in a strategic way so they can respond to the pressing challenges of the time and set a strategic goal that, they show which mountain to climb in which timeline, and then they direct their officials. You make that happen. That's the value of Quad. So in my view, Quad, for the time being, will remain as it is as 4 members.
As a Quad, because if there was one more, it would become the Pentagon. Ambassador Garcetti, the Quad's already taken a hit this year because of your election schedule and the fact that US President Joseph Biden, who was invited as the Republic Day guest, was not able to come. A Quad summit that was planned for the next day with all the other leaders was not able to happen. Do you see an in-person Quad summit happening in 2024?
Absolutely, and this president's committed to it. I think it's going to be right after the election, hopefully, is what
Ours
we
or
would plan.
yours?
Ours. I think he might be a little bit busy right after your election, but in some ways, as exciting as last year was for the US-India relationship, I mean, we had a state visit of the Prime Minister, we had the President here for G20, a bilateral before that. Our Secretary of Treasury, for instance, Secretary Yellen, this was the #1 country she went to in the world, outside the US 4 times. We go straight through the cabinet, other officials. It was an embarrassment of riches. We actually need a little bit more time to put that agenda back together. So it isn't a setback as much as we would have loved to have seen the president here for Republic Day. It was, right now, for instance, we're going to see some officials come here and do what's called the ISET Intercessional, and let me speak English, that's the Initiative on Critical Emerging Technologies, and do some Quad work on the side to look at those defining technologies of our lifetime, and again, look at how we can get past talk and aspiration and get to more program. So I think by the time we get to something later in the year, it will actually be much more productive, much more robust than kind of flipping it a few months after they were able to do it before.
All right. You know, the thing about you, Ambassador Garcetti, is we can be sure that there's always news in everything you say. Journalist delight. Prime Minister Turnbull, since you are not, in a sense, as the others are in government, I can ask you this question. We look around the world. That's true. We look around the world and we say, okay, obviously the world is having trouble trusting China again. But there has been movement. The US is back in dialogue. They're discussing the future of AI together. There was the San Francisco summit. Australia has made moves in terms of business. India, which has its other problems with China at the line of actual control, has seen a fairly milder year if it comes to the tensions between the two countries. The Prime Minister and President Xi Jinping met. My question to you, is the Quad always going to hinge on a kind of common shared perception when it comes to the South China Sea and the Pacific side?
I just say, I think what Philip Green said, our ambassador said, is something we should note very carefully. I mean, the Quad, if you go back to 2019, if you go back to 2017, if you go back to 2005, it has moved so far. So we should really be reflecting on not why it hasn't, you know, turned into a full strategic alliance, but how far it actually has come, you know, given that the countries involved have different values. I mean, India was the leader of, is still the leader of the non-aligned movement insofar as that's still current. And, you know, to some extent, the Quad is a case of same bed, different dreams. It doesn't mean that we don't have any dreams in common. I think the point is we have some of our dreams are different, but we have a lot of dreams in common, and they are the ones that Shinzo Abe described in his original vision. As far as China's concerned, look, China has different values, a different history, a different political values to the democracies. There's no question about that. And there have been real tensions in the region, particularly in the South China Sea. Australia's position, I think, is shared by most other countries in the region, which is that the rule of law should prevail, full stop. I mean, that's all we're asking for. And I think we've got to, you know, get back to what, you know, our dear friend, very lamented friend Shinzo Abe said. You know, this is all about a free and open Indo-Pacific, and the fundamental thing is that we have to make sure that might is not right. You know, we can't allow ourselves to let this region get into the situation where, you know, the strong do as they will and the weak suffer as they must, right? And so countries that are committed to freedom, that are committed together, doesn't mean they're going to agree on every issue, let alone every conflict. But it does mean that they can stand together to defend freedom, sovereignty, and the openness that democracies demand.
You know, those words are really powerful, and as you say them, I'll just point out a few things, and Prime Minister Turnbull, if you'd like to react to them. When you speak about the need for, you know, the strong must not overpower the weaker countries, and the rule of law, the rules-based international order, and all the rest, how do you explain that, again, on the Quad, all the countries don't agree on an issue like what's happened in Israel and Palestine and Israel's constant bombardment of Gaza, despite the fact that the entire world thought they were on the same page talking about a two-state solution. Here's Israel saying, no, it's only a one-state solution that we believe in. When I look around my own region, I see Afghanistan, where a group that was brought down to an agreement where they said they would allow a political process, that they would allow women inside the work sphere, are not even allowing little girls back into school. In Afghanistan with the Taliban, you have Myanmar, where the military junta was allowed to overthrow a democratic government. And yet, what we find is that this international rule of law is not prevailing anywhere. What is your sense of how likely it is that the Quad can ensure that the rule of law prevails in other parts of the world where we're dealing with much more powerful powers?
Well, Suhasini, could I just answer it this way? Just because the Quad can't do everything doesn't mean it can't do anything.
Well, don't let the great become the enemy of the good, is what you're saying.
Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. The Australians here will know, they've heard me say that before in a lot of situations. Constant problem in politics.
All right. Ambassador Saran, I got a very diplomatic answer over there. Do you have a take on it?
I want to, this is nothing to do with government. This is just as a professional diplomat, what I see in the role of the Quad. I have no doubt in my mind that the cement which holds the Quad together is China. And no matter how much we try to, sort of make out that, it's not against any country. Maybe it's not against China, but it is certainly being made more crystallized as a result of a common sense amongst all our partners that the balance of power, certainly in what we call the Indo-Pacific, has been changing against us. And therefore, if we do not work together, this balance is going to get worse. China's reaction? China said first, Quad, this is just some fluff on the ocean wave. Said this doesn't matter at all. I don't think they would say that anymore.
Well, Russia refused to use the term Indo-Pacific for a long while.
So I think I would say that China is important factor, maybe not the only factor. Now, as far as the security dimension is concerned, please note something. There are 3 countries who are military allies. India is not a military ally. But please do not forget that in the last few years, India has some of the most elaborate security arrangements with each one of them. If you take the Malabar exercises, today the Malabar exercises are at least one domain in which all these countries are actually to some extent working interoperationally. So I think if you're looking at a longer perspective, I did say that the Quad did not come to amount to very much in the early stages, but today I think it has acquired a substance and a role which could not have been foreseen.
All right, so we need a new lexicon perhaps for Quad allies or quasi-allies or Quad-I or one of those. Now I do want to take questions because I've already seen a few people put their hands up. If you want to go with the mic to the lady up front in the fourth row.
Good evening, everybody. Yeah.
Just speak
So,
into it.
I am Radhe Tambi. I work with Center for Air Power Studies in New Delhi as a researcher working on the island states in the Indo-Pacific. So my question is more specific of what future can we foresee of Quad in the island nations, particularly because individually these countries want to do something or are doing in the island countries where they're playing a very important role in playing a balancing role in the region, particularly when we see the recent example of Maldives. So what kind of future do we foresee for the Quad? How can they come together?
To work in all the islands together.
Yeah.
Okay. There's a young gentleman in the front, and then I'll come to the back. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Dhruv. Do you think there's any issue in Quad which, if solved, can help it function more effectively and efficiently?
Good question. Do you want to just sprint back to the back? And there's a lady with her hand up. We can just get her.
Hello. My question is that there is a growing concern of militarization of the Indo-Pacific. With the Quad countries, they're deciding to jointly monitor the movement of ships and submarines using satellites and participating
shipping network.
in the Malabar exercise. So is it a possibility that it could turn into a security organization in future?
All right, this is a very well-informed audience, I must say. And let's just get a fourth right at the back. Right at the back. Just go right to the back. On your right side, I haven't taken enough questions on the other side. Behind you. Thanks.
Namaste,
Namaste.
and good evening. Since seeing this esteemed panelist, I'm just going to stutter. So I'm just going to basically read out from my paper.
Please.
Since the talk is on Indo-Pacific, I'll want to ask if there is a provision of Indo-Pacific Quad, and how you going to address it without reform of UNSC, and also when all the countries talk about rule-based order, when US and many states haven't signed UN clause.
All right. We've got 4 real zingers for questions. I'm going to go through the entire panel. I want you to give me an answer to each in 1 minute each. And also, if you want to add something about what you see the Quad doing next, that would be good. Do you want to start, Ambassador Garcetti?
I'll try in 1 minute. Pacific Islands, a great example is in Fiji, where we're coming together in this trilateral development work where we brought Fijian health officials to learn from Indians about how to do remote telemedicine. Funded by USAID, a great example, and we're looking to do that in more places. The digital stack that India has innovated, looking at American servers and companies to help power that in countries that might not be able to do digital ID, health ID, universal payments. Those are some great examples, I think, in the Pacific Islands. If there's one thing I'd change, I would make things more operational, and I think we're doing that in a lot of places. I can't read what the third one was.
UNCLOS.
What was it?
UNCLOS. The fact that the US hasn't ratified UNCLOS yet.
There's plenty of conventions, I think, that we can go through each of these countries. You can ask my personal opinions on those on the side, but I do believe that the larger conversation about whether international law is crumbling, international law wouldn't have to exist if it wasn't challenged all the time.
Okay,
but I
your
do
1
see the
minute
ability
is
to go
up.
forward. Thank you.
Prime Minister Turnbull.
Oh, can I say one last thing?
Yes.
Before it gets misreported? I was not announcing a November thing. I was saying I believe it's a high likelihood.
All right.
Thank you.
Well, I think it'd be great if the United States ratified UNCLOS, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, but it has to be said that the United States, by and large, complies with it, even though it hasn't signed it and seeks to uphold it. As far as the small Pacific Island states are concerned, the critical thing is to provide them support and above all to do so with aid rather than seeing them burdened down with excessive debt that they can't afford. And as Philip remembers, during my time as PM, rather than have the Solomon Islands and PNG take on a huge debt to build a fibre optic network, we basically ensured that it was paid for with aid and got it built. We've actually got to deliver. If you want to, contend with rivalry from China, for example, in the Pacific, you've basically got to offer these countries real development opportunities.
Well, that's certainly substantial. High Commissioner Green.
Okay, on the US and freedom of and UNCLOS, yes, of course, it would be a good thing that the US was to ratify that treaty. But in the meantime, not only do they broadly abide by it, the United States is the country in the region which is defending freedom of navigation through its annual freedom of navigation operations. And without that, it would be a much rougher Indo-Pacific. The question on the Pacific Island states, this is really important that we talk about what these countries and their regional groupings need. There's been no mention today of the Pacific Islands Forum, of ASEAN and IORA, the Organization for Indian Ocean Island States. These are mechanisms by which these states can help retain their sovereignty by operating together and giving themselves strategic weight against the mighty.
Okay.
So that's why Australia is a big supporter of the Pacific Islands Forum and indeed of ASEAN. And the gentleman who asked, what would you like to solve? Solving problems in international law, in my experience, is something that we seldom do, but we can improve situations. And the thing that I wanted to hammer today is the work we're doing to bring telecommunications capability of a sort that's open and free to Pacific Island nations who otherwise wouldn't get it or would get it in a way that might prejudice their security. We're making a big difference.
Sure. So the sum of the parts is bigger than the whole, and everyone works with their spheres of influence. Ambassador Suzuki.
Well, we four great countries want to be forces for good. So we join hands to provide whatever those Pacific Island countries need. Examples have been given about Fiji, but for example, Palau, we're trying to provide ORAN capabilities. Anyway, what we want is by providing those concrete assistance, we want to encourage abidance of rule of law, because we don't want to see countries swamped by debt trap, for example. So we want to provide alternatives, which say Japan is promoting quality infrastructure, in which we put emphasis on openness, transparency, economic viability, and sustainability of debt, for example. Those are the approaches of Quad. So as long as we can be of help in promoting rule of law, we're all for cooperating from the position of wherever we can cooperate.
All right, Ambassador Saran, would India welcome the Quad to do a joint initiative in the Indian Ocean? I think the lady was talking about Maldives there.
I think, even if we are not able to announce that we are doing something jointly with respect to, say, Maldives or Sri Lanka, if you see how Quad countries, even if they have not acted as Quad, they have worked very closely together, for example, to deal with the kind of crisis that Sri Lanka has faced recently. Similarly, you will find in some other places also that the countries are working together. So I think last point I would make is, don't look at the slice. Look at how the trajectory has actually manifested itself over the last several years. And I think if you look at that trajectory, it is quite remarkable how this crystallization of this organization has taken place.
All right, a work in progress, but a lot of work done already. You've been a great panel, and I'm sorry that I couldn't take more questions, but there goes the buzzer. But I do have one request, if you could all just stay in your seats, because I wanted to get a picture with the entire Quad panel, but with you in the background. So we're going to just do that.